Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Women in the Military podcast. I'm really excited to talk to Les this week about not only his book, This Troubled Ground, but also a little bit about his military story. So, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Amanda, so much.
So, I always like to ask, why did you decide to join the military? So, even though we're going to talk a lot about your book, I wanted to start there.
Well, when I joined the military in 1985, it was a whole different um, world than we have now. I mean, it was basically peacetime. I joined because I thought it would be a good career. I'd like to say that I was like really patriotic and I was patriotic, but there wasn't a post 9/11 situation or anything like that. I just joined because I was looking for a better career, and I knew people in the Air Force, family members, and people that were having good careers in the Air Force, and so I decided that would be something that I should look into.
And did you join on active duty or through the Reserve or National Guard?
Yeah, I just went and contacted a recruiter, and I had a college degree, and back then, I mean, if you had a college degree, you could pretty much come in as an officer. So I went and talked to a recruiter, got an interview, and basically signed up or agreed to join. Even before I'd even talked to my wife about it, like before the first interview, I told her I was going in for a job interview, but I had already talked to the recruiter and already kind of decided, and I knew she would go along with it. She had an uncle who was retired from the Air Force, a couple cousins that were either at the Air Force Academy or recently graduated from the Air Force Academy. So I knew she would be, she would be in favor of it. She'd be okay with it. But we did obviously eventually talk about it more. But I mean, it wasn't like I was, going to join the CIA or something. I knew she would, be in favor of a possible Air Force career.
Yeah. Okay. So you joined pretty easily. And then what was your career field?
I was in public affairs. I had a degree in journalism. I had been a newspaper reporter. I did the test for, the pre-pilot training test. And as soon as I looked at those numbers buried in that colorblind book, and the recruiter said, like, what number do you see? And I say, I don't see any number. And then she said, like, now what would be your next choice? Because you're not going to be a pilot. So I said, well, I'm a journalist. And I think I said something like public relations. And she said, okay, public affairs. And I kind of knew that career field because where I was working at the newspaper, the people came over from Myrtle Beach Air Force Base and published their newspaper at our local paper. And so I had talked to some of the NCOs and airmen from the base that were in public affairs. So I kind of knew the career field a little bit. I knew it was the public relations, journalism, newsletters, media relations. I knew it was kind of that career field.
Yeah. So can you talk about like any of the highlights of your career? I would say, I guess, between when you joined in 85-ish to 9/11.
Well, 85, when I joined, things were pretty quiet. Went to Germany for a year and a half, came back, went to Charleston Air Force Base, and then decided to get out and go in the South Carolina Air National Guard. So after about 4.5 years of active duty, I joined the South Carolina Air National Guard. And the base was like a mile from where I had grown up, out in the country outside of Columbia, South Carolina. So I joined in 1989, and I was the state public affairs director for the South Carolina Military Department, Army, and Air Guard. I was an Air Guard first lieutenant. And 3 weeks after I joined, Hurricane Hugo hit the coast of South Carolina. We activated, 7,000 National Guard members. It was, one of our biggest natural disasters we had ever had to deal with. And I thought that's mostly how my career was going to be. I thought it was going to be more hurricanes, tornadoes, homegrown situations, sort of the traditional National Guard role. That's how I thought my career was going to be. And then 1 year later, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and of course everything changed in the rest of my career in some way, shape, or form was related to Iraq, Afghanistan. That sort of, even though we'd continued to train in Norway for and England for possible uh, conflicts with the Soviet Union until the wall fell, but we continued to serve there. Did you hear that dog bark? We continued to serve there and or train there. I mean, but our focus shifted to Southwest Asia pretty much in the 90s, and that's where it's been ever since.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting that you're like, "Oh, this is what I'm doing," like, you know, natural disasters, that kind of response, and then
Yeah.
everything changed.
I mean, I thought, heck, Hugo, we'll probably have that every year, and we've had a lot of things similar, but nothing quite that bad. I mean, we're going through a situation now with Hurricane Debbie, which down on the coast of South Carolina has created a lot of flooding, and um, National Guard is out right now on the streets down on the coast of South Carolina with Hurricane Debbie. But and we did that, we did that a lot. Plus we deployed to other disasters too. I mean, we sent a lot of people to Louisiana during or in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and I mean that's an ongoing thing that was done throughout my career. But operationally, things shifted to the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and and our unit is still deploying there to this day. I've been
Yeah.
retired for 10 years, but they're still going there.
Yeah. Yeah, and then, so it sounds like the shift to focus on the Middle East was already there after Desert Storm, and then September 11th just, ratcheted up another notch. So,
Yeah.
what was your career like after September 11th?
Well, kind of the same. Just let me say that during the 90s, we did a lot of the deployments to Southwest Asia with the no-fly zones and that kind of thing prior to 9/11. And then, of course, at 9/11, being at an Air National Guard F-16 base, we were immediately um, that day. I mean, we loaded live missiles on our aircraft and set them on the live ramp on the base, and we were prepared to respond immediately. And then very shortly after that, we began deploying to Southwest Asia, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and eventually directly to Afghanistan. But yeah, so after 9/11, I mean, it's been all about Iraq and Afghanistan, pretty much.
Yeah. Yeah, and I should have known because there's a F-16 base in my hometown in Fresno, and I remember, September 11th, the F-16s flying overhead, and I mean before September 11th, I don't really remember them, but now whenever I go home, you always see them, and it's something that was I'm sure was always there, but now it's like front of mind and like yeah, they were always
I
flying.
mean, live missiles on an F-16 is a big deal. I mean, if you're
Yeah,
unless you're at Nellis or somewhere like that. I mean, at McIntyre Air National Guard Base, putting live missiles on an F-16 is rare. Um, and we did it. We had to put the aircraft in a particular place so that if there was some kind of obviously release of the weapon, they would go. There were houses and farms all around the base.
right.
So yeah, and I don't remember. I was the wing executive officer and public affairs officer, and I don't remember if the commander was told to do it or if he just did it. I don't remember. He might have been somebody might have told him to do it. He might have just said, by instinct, might have just made the decision. We're going to get our aircraft ready. So I
Yeah.
don't recall. I don't recall exactly. But obviously I wasn't in on every conversation. He could have gotten a call from somewhere and been told to load live ammunition.
Yeah, I mean, it's just bringing back memories from that day.
So
It was
that was a horrible day.
yeah, yeah. I was a senior in high school, and it changed the rest of my life. And it's just one of those days that like you never forget.
Oh yeah.
Cause yeah. And so one of the deployments you wrote about in your book, and I think you did it in your real life, if I'm remembering right. My brain's a little scrambled because it's still summer, but was being at Dover and helping with the dignified transfers. What was that experience like? Because I don't think a lot of people know about it or understand what it is.
Yeah, and that's kind of why, that's kind of why I felt like I could be on this show, even though it's primarily geared to women in the military, um, because I was on the ramp at Dover for 100 dignified transfers. Uh, Men and women, came home. It was mostly men, but we did have some women that returned as well. We had a lot of families on the base, a lot of wives, sisters, mothers, um, on the base, and I just got to see a lot of strong women. And then later, we did a documentary called "Bringing the Fallen Home," and I went and interviewed a lot of those Gold Star families. Only one family whose loved one came home while I was at Dover, and I interviewed for the documentary. We interviewed a lot of other families, but there was one family that I interviewed who was on the ramp when I was on the ramp at Dover with their loved one coming home, and so I interviewed them for the documentary, and I've just gained even a greater respect for Gold Star mothers, for wives, for uh, just strong women who held on to their families and kept their families together through the worst tragedies possible. And so part of the book is it's a mostly fictional account of a particular Gold Star mother, but it's a composite of many of these Gold Star mothers and wives that I've met and have interviewed and have grown to have great respect for.
Yeah. Yeah, I just thought it was really interesting. I love that it was fiction, but so real and visceral that you could like feel and understand what was, it wasn't it was just so well done in the way that you told the story of like being on the ramp and like the emotions that you felt as, the officer who was there, and your whole team. I feel like you did a good job of explaining, because I think sometimes people don't realize how much, I guess, mental strain and even like it was really cold, at least in the book, the whole
Yeah,
time you guys were
I
there. And so
was
like
there
physic
from. Sorry, I'm sorry. I was there from the
oh,
beginning of November till the end of February. And while we were there, we had the heaviest snowfall they had at Dover in 20, 30 years. And we had a lot of nights and we did most of the dignified transfers at night. So we had a lot of nights we were out there in the middle of the night, early in the morning when it's the coldest. And I remember going out there sometimes. There was a big weather. It was just a big one of those light signs that flashed the temperature. And I remember going out there and seeing 15 degrees and 10 degrees, but also combined with that, you'd have 20, 30 mile an hour wind. So yeah, it was a lot of cold days and cold nights on the ramp there. And that was one of the big challenges, really, was to try to keep the families comfortable where they could be out there as well. Cause sometimes they would be, on the ramp 20 or 30 minutes. Um, yeah, so it was that was an unbelievable time. And I wanted to write about it. I mean, you can only write so much, but I mean, I think I pushed about as far as you can go, as far as writing about the service there. Um, and even most military people don't know that story. I mean, you really basically have to be there to understand, and not just on the ramp for that particular event, but all the behind the scenes, being in the mortuary, seeing the people who take care of the bodies and get them ready for burial, the people that prepare the uniforms, and that's what our documentary "Bringing the Fallen Home" was mostly about, the carry teams, and we talked about really the whole process of taking care of the fallen and the families. But I wanted to write that in the book as well.
yeah. No, it was really powerful. It reminded me, I read rule number 2, which rule number 1 is that people die at war, and rule number 2 is there's nothing you can do to prevent that. And it talked a lot about death because I mean with the title, but she talked about like the mortuary affairs teams and like how much they were struggling because of, the work that they had to do. It was so important and they had a lot of honor and pride in what they were doing, but it also had this huge mental strain of like seeing the bodies and, trying to get them pieced back together. And it's just, and I thought that book was really eye opening because I didn't think a lot about, the psychology and all the stuff that takes to get from, someone who gets injured and then killed on the battlefield and then all that it takes to get home. And so it was really interesting to hear um, even more about it as the side of Dover. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's a great duty, important assignment. It's also very difficult, and it's not for everybody. I mean, you've got to have the personality to be able to do that. You got to be super patient, understanding, compassionate, and most people are, but not everybody is. And it's not for everybody. I mean, you've got to be able to really um, put others before yourself basically in every situation. I mean, if you're out there on the ramp and it's 15 degrees and you're freezing to death, and that transfer case is coming off the plane and you've got family members right beside you, you've got to hold it together. I mean, and if your feet are freezing, you're just going to have to deal with it. But and it's not just that, it's the emotional part of it too. I mean, it's a process. So we got into a process, and I kind of wrote that. I mean, we'd get the calls and we'd know who's coming and what service and when they were coming. And it was, we try not to let it get routine, but we did have checklists and rules and policies and everything that we followed, and we stuck with those, and um, without trying to let that get mundane or get to be routine.
yeah. Yeah, yeah, it was really interesting to read about. I think it also really set the tone for the book because that's where it starts. And so I was wondering, why did you decide to write a book that's, it's fiction, but it's based a lot on your experience? Why did you decide to write a book?
It's a lot. I mean, the Dover part is very much biographical or autobiographical. There's just a couple of events at Dover that led me into this fictional story that I wanted to do later. And even the part where I get to Afghanistan or back to Afghanistan, that's pretty close to accurate. I actually use other people's experiences and kind of brought them all into the main character. But and then there's a fictional story that I want everybody to get the book and read it. So I'm not going to tell every detail, but yeah, but I had a lot of experiences before I ever thought about a book of how I would tell my family about the experiences, family, friends, parents, loved ones, wife, children, etc. And I just kind of thought these incredible, extraordinary things are happening, and I want to be able to tell my family about it. I was a writer, so I knew I could put it in some kind of words that I could probably do better than talking about it. So eventually that's what happened. But it took about 10 years because I was writing. First, it was kind of a memoir, and then it was more fiction. And then I thought, well, I'm going to do this combination. I want to tell this fictional story. I want to tell this autobiographical material. And that's why it basically says a novel based on real events, because it is a novel because it's certainly not fully memoir, fully biographical or autobiographical, but it's definitely a story that is based on a lot of my own experiences and other people's that I know or knew at the time.
Yeah, it's the second book that I've read that is fictional, but based on, real events, but also fiction. And I thought both of your book and the other book was called Kurtz. Um, it really got me thinking about the like policies and coming home and just like it really got me thinking. And I think sometime with memoirs you're like telling your story and it's really hard to have like an underlying theme that really gets the reader thinking about different things because in fiction you have a little bit of leeway, especially in the Kurt's book of like talking about things that generals did that weren't supposed to
Mhm.
happen, and it's fiction, so he could make it up, or bend the truth, or say it's fiction but base it on someone. And so it was really interesting to read his book, and then when I was reading your book and realizing like the underlying themes, and just as a veteran who went to Afghanistan and thinking like, what was it all about? Was it worth it? I think it's really good to ask those questions, and then to have a book that talks about it and gets your mind going and thinking.
Yeah. Before the 2021 withdrawal, I had finished the book, and it had closed with a lot of hope. That's what I was trying to do, is put hope in the hearts of Gold Star families primarily, and that's and so the fictional character, I was trying to allow her to use her journalistic talents to give hope to people. But then after 2021, I thought, well, now what am I going to do? I didn't know if I still had a book, and so I just wrote an epilogue. And I mean, I didn't hold back on my feelings of how I thought that went, and if people, a lot of mistakes were made with that withdrawal, and I didn't hold back on my feelings about that. And I didn't really hold back on talking about some of the leaders that I worked with, whether they were great or I thought not so great. Maybe they were great. Maybe I didn't think they were great. It just depends on, it just depends. But yeah, there were a few senior officers that I didn't particularly think did that good of a job, and I didn't mind saying it because they wouldn't mind. They tell me if I didn't do a good job. So they wouldn't hold back on me as a lieutenant colonel. So um, yeah. So anyway, I was really honest with, I think, in the book too. But but I wanted to give people hope, and I wanted my family to be able to know what I went through.
Yeah, it's interesting to know that because, like, obviously I read it after the withdrawal, uh, and the epilogue, I mean, it fit perfectly with the book, I felt like, and so it just went with the story. Um, but that's really interesting to know. I don't know, it's just I really love reading well-written books about people's experiences in the military because you always learn so much, and then as a veteran, I also, you know, process a lot of the things that I felt and hear things that I experienced that someone else experienced, and so it's just I guess it's like another version of therapy for me to read all these
Yeah.
books, and so, um, yes. So, besides and I'm like, where am I gonna go with this question? So what do you want people to walk away from the book? I mean, I guess you said hope, but now that the withdrawal happened, what do you want people to walk away from the book feeling
Well,
after they've read it?
I still want people to have hope. I mean, I spent a year of my life there. I want to believe that it made a difference of some kind. But one of the things after the withdrawal, I started talking to a lot of Gold Star families that I knew to ask them their feelings, and I put some of this in the epilogue. And they still had hope. They still believed that their loved one fought for something and died for something. And their main thing is they don't want people to forget. They just don't want people to forget about their loved one locally, but everyone collectively, all the Gold Star families, all the fallen service members. Um, and I that's what I'm trying to do. I think that's sort of what has turned into my mission, I guess, is to write and produce video products, documentary products that tell that story, and to keep people thinking about those that are fallen, but their families they left behind as well.
Yeah. No, I think that's really good. And I think that's why it's so important that, you know, we write our stories as veterans, or, we share our stories on podcasts or whatever, so that people can remember, and hear about the wars. And if, you know, I've had people who have talked about people who died when they were deployed, and they share their story, and that shares the person who's died story. And so I think it's so important to remember those we lost, and just how the military, or how the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan affected us as a country. So, if you're a veteran who deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan and you're considering writing a book, what advice would you give to them?
Oh, I don't know. If you're considering writing a book now, I'm going to hope that you took a lot of good notes back when you were there. Um, I mean, I couldn't go and just write a book now had I not taken hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes and written down journal experiences, and produced a documentary where I interviewed a lot of Gold Star families, and brought some of that into the book as well. But if you've got a lot of notes and you've got a story to tell, just put it down on paper. Um, if you're gonna publish a book and people are gonna want to buy it, it's gonna have to be well written. It's gonna have to be a story that people want to read. And that was a challenge for me. I at first was just writing down a lot of experiences, but then I thought, if I'm gonna have a book that a publisher will publish and people will pay to read, then it's got to be a good story. And that's kind of where I took some of the, added the fictional part of the story and everything too, and the epilogue and the characters, and used a lot of real characters. Um, I do want to say one thing, and I don't think this will be giving it away too much, but when I when I thought I was going to write a memoir, I had one of my colleagues there write what was going to be the foreword. And then when my publisher and I decided we're going to go novel, I said, "Well, what about this forward?" He said, "I don't really think I don't really think the forward goes well with a novel." And so I had this really well written thing from one of my friends, and so I thought, I'm gonna figure out a way to put that in the book. And so I did. I made it where when he was going home, that character was going home. He left that to me, and he said, "I know one day you'll write a book, so I'm gonna go ahead and give you, and will ask me to do the forward. So I'm gonna go ahead and give you my forward in advance." So I put that in the book as a fictional forward to a fictional book that the character in the book would write one day. But I did make it, I did make sure that I made a note that who wrote that, my friend Charlie Statlander. He actually wrote that. I won't, I made a note to make sure people would know that he actually wrote that, not me. I didn't write that. He wrote that.
I wondered if that was real because it was so well written, and it was so good. And
Yeah, that
so
forward you're talking about,
yeah,
that was
I know
good.
where it is in the book. Like, I remember
Yeah,
that
he
part.
read the
So
book. Yeah, well, I mean, I didn't write that. That really was written by Charlie Church in the book, who's based on a colleague that I served with, a civilian. I call him a young man because he's young. He's young to me, but um, he was as good. He was and is as good at the job as I described in the book. He was exceptional, and so when he wrote that, and then we were talking about not using it, I thought, well, that's just so unfair. I mean, he worked one. He had to work really hard on it for quite a bit of time, and so I thought I'm gonna figure out a way somehow. And I'm glad I came up with a way to use that, because I wanted. I mean, it just gave another person's thoughts. I mean, it gave a whole different perspective, another perspective to
yeah.
what we were doing in Afghanistan.
No, it added depth to the book. So yeah, I'm really glad that you were able to work it in because I think it was, I mean, it was one of my favorite parts, the way that it was added in and how it gave such a unique perspective. And so I think that's really cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
everything
think
else about that character is pretty much based on a real person. I just the forward part in that document and everything is something that I fictionalized or added, that I came up with and added as part of the
yeah.
story, part of the book.
That's really cool. Yeah, I think yeah, if you have a lot of notes, I have a lot of notes. But one of the things that encouraged me is you said it took you 10 years, and like you started with a memoir and then you moved around. And I feel like that's like having the notes is like step one, but then you have to figure out like how to get it into a story, and not just a
Yeah,
story, but a story that people want to read. I think I took a writing class and they talked about like the third rail of a story, something that like and oftentimes I've been reading books and it's just someone telling a story, but there's no driving forward point, and I'm like, where are we going with this? And where's the third rail? And so I really like that this book had that.
I mean, the way I did it might be harder than actually if you had a fictional story and you say I'm gonna write a novel and you can just write, basically you can just write how you want it to go, and since you're creating it yourself the whole time, it might be easier um, than taking a conglomeration of notes, mostly true material, a novel idea that you've got that you thought might have been a whole separate book or story, and figuring out how to make that into a book, into a book. It's probably a little tougher than or writing a straight nonfiction book where you're going to write it based
Right.
on your straight from your notes and interviews and that kind of thing. I mean, I'm writing another novel now that I'm almost done with, and it's sort of been the same. It's sort of been the same thing. It's been a long process, but when I got busy and really started to write it, it came to me fast. And I mean, I'm writing basically as fast as I can every day because the story is already in my head and written down in outline form, and so I know exactly where I want it to go. I just hope I can get it there.
Yeah. I mean, writing is such an art, and I think people don't realize all the intricacies. That's not how you say that word. Of getting a story to be, not just a story, but a story that people want to read. And I think you did just such a great job of like getting people thinking about things in their own life. And, if they read it and they're not a veteran, they get to hear about the experience of what it was like to be a Dover and then be overseas in Afghanistan. And so I really enjoyed it.
Yeah,
So,
thank you.
I always like to end my interview with advice for the next generation. So, if someone who's listening is considering joining the military, what advice would you give them?
Um, it's a good career. One of the things, and I can kind of add an anecdote to this to answer your question. When I go talk to National Guard members and go to conferences and stuff, I tell National Guard members, "Hey, read this book because this is a perfect example that of you never know where you might end up." I started out as an Air Force Public Affairs officer. I was in the National Guard. We were doing hurricanes at home. Ended up in Afghanistan. Ended up on the ramp at Dover. Ended up writing a book. And so I tell young National Guard members, just work hard, do your best, be willing to do things that maybe you didn't think you might do or want to do, because you just never know with the way the world is, that where you might end up and what responsibilities you might have, the places you might go. Like that Dr. Seuss book, "Oh, the Places We'll Go," or whatever the name of it is. I did a little reference to that because I mean, I started writing down all these places and thinking, "Oh, the places I'll go," and I never thought I'd be writing down places like Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, Herat, Kandahar, Mazar-e Sharif, and places like that. So, that's what I tell all people, but most of the young people thinking about military careers that I have contact with are usually looking at the Guard because they're sons or daughters of friends, or sons, daughters, grandchildren of people I served with. So it's usually people, but I tell them it's not, don't, and I'm sure recruiters tell them now, it's not the 1 weekend a month and 2 weeks a year, like we used to promote it. It's
Yeah.
a it's a, it's a career that could take you anywhere in the world for you know deployment periods of time, not just 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, the more I've learned about the National Guard and the Reserve, it's a big commitment. There's so many things going on, and it's not exactly what I expected when I started this podcast. So, thank you so much for your service. Thank you for writing this book, and thank you for being a guest on the show. I really appreciate having you on.
Well, thank you. Can I do one thing before we close?
Yeah, oh, I have your book. I
Oh, I
looked
know.
at it,
Okay.
but I
Well, I was just going to say, let's see here. Where are you, camera? The book is This Troubled Ground. And I hope people will get it and read it um, and appreciate it, learn from it too. I mean, I think it's informative, and I hope people will learn from it and
yeah,
appreciate it.
I agree. I think that there's something to learn, and it gets you thinking about different things, so,
And
I'll have the
appreciate
link
the
to.
people in it. You know, the people in it, whether they're people I use directly or whether they're characters based on some really amazing people.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll put the link in the show notes so that people can order it easily, and, thank you so much for being a guest.
Thanks, Amanda. I appreciate it.